So before I go into this, I just want to say I don't like going into this. Okay. But because I got a genuine question, I will. At first, when I got the question, I fluffed it off. Because most people who ask the question genuinely don't want to understand. They just want to have something in their brains, and that's what they want to go with. So I don't really waste my time. But I'm going to address this. What I'm going to address it with the history in your face. Okay? I'm African American. When I say that, I'm speaking about the descendants of the enslaved here in the United States of America. As an African American, my people have a long, long history here that many people around the globe do not understand nor want to understand. This is for the people who do really want to understand. Because my people's history goes back to the founding of this country, we were here along with indigenous and whites. At the time of our arriving here in the United States of America, before it became the United States of America, and when we arrived enslaved, and a little bit before that, indigenous Americans were also being enslaved. This also happened in the Caribbean. There were indigenous people there. Africans came. People lived together. This happens all over the globe. People live together. They work together. They even intermingle, marry, have children. Okay? Way back in the 15 and 1600s. In the United States of America, many of the women, the African women and African American women, were essayed. Same thing happened in the Caribbean. What's rarely spoken about is how during in the process of all this there were indigenous and African interaction. What's not mostly talked about is the fact that there were also children being born from indigenous and African lineages. Not all African people who were brought here enslaved interacted like this with the indigenous. And it depends on what time they were brought here. Keep that in mind. The transatlantic slave trade happened for a very long time. So it depends on where you were taken enslaved as an African person and when you were taken. Okay? As to how things would go with you when you got on American soil. These two things, like how you were brought and where you were taken, this would affect who you would interact with. Okay? The United States is big. So just because someone is in the United States, an African person came enslaved to the United States, does not mean that they interacted in the same way as another in another state. So now let's get into it. So here's an article called Bonded by History. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but as you can read yourself, then it says, few blacks in the U.S. realize their familiar ties to American Indians are evidence of an important historical process. Carter G. Woodson, read right there, noted the interactions between Europeans and Africans, and between Europeans and American Indians. Okay, but a third part of the triangle remained unexplored. Okay, one of the longest unwritten chapters of the history in the United States is that treating of the relations of the Negroes and the Indians. As you can see, Europeans interacted with the indigenous. Indigenous, of course, interacted with the indigenous. Therefore, you should already conclude that, of course, Africans interacted with the indigenous. Not all Europeans had children with the indigenous. Not all Africans had children with the indigenous. But there are some. This is where we get the term the Black Indian. As you can see right there. Europeans had few qualms about selling Indians they had captured in battle to slave traders. In fact, American Indians were not exempt from enslavement until well after the American Revolution. The besieged Indian nations needed allies, and runaway African slaves who soon came to see the Indians' villages as safe havens proved eager to help fight the colonists. American Indians allowed their villages to serve as stations on the network of safe houses that became known in the 1800s as the Underground Railroad. Indeed, many African Americans who sought freedom in Indian villages were treated as sisters and brothers, and some groups, such as the Mohawks in New York, encouraged intermarriage with them. The children of these unions were treated as full members of the tribe and served as a bridge between two cultures. Black people born in those unions are of dual heritage. This is not all African Americans that were born in a dual heritage situation like that. Mohawks. They were talking about the Mohawks right there. So remember, it was where you were and who you interacted with and the relationships that you formed. Okay. And every black person's ancestor did not form the same relationships with the same groups of people. And of course, if you were enslaved, you were being essayed by mainly Europeans. Perhaps no American Indian group had closer ties to the Africans than did the Seminoles, a breakaway segment of the Creek Nation. Around the time of the American Revolution, blacks who fled to Spanish Florida from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Carolinas encountered bands of Seminoles, and the two groups became allies. The blacks, who largely descended from ethnic groups of the rice-growing regions of West Africa, soon taught their American Indian friends how to cultivate grain. Eventually, blacks and Seminoles intermarried and formed a prosperous biracial community whose members ran plantations that stretched for miles along Florida's fertile Appalachia River. In 1819, the U.S. government purchased Florida and proceeded to stamp out the Seminoles, black and red, who had been raiding white settlers' plantations and fiercely repelling attacks on their own camps. Over the next 4 decades, the Seminoles fought the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines in 3 wars. So we're going to skip down here. Many whites believed that the surest way to prevent Indians from hiding runaway enslaved black people was to make them masters, thereby giving them a personal investment in African bondage. They believed that by doing this, they would no longer shelter fugitive slaves once they came to see the value of their labor. Because the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, known as the 5 civilized tribes, lived in the South, whites considered their acceptance of slavery vital to maintaining order in the region and encouraged slave ownership within these nations. As slave owning took hold, it brought rigid satisfaction to the previously fluid American Indian society that helped weave racial prejudice into the fabric of Indian communities. Now, the next part I'm going to read is the hierarchy. Soon, a class hierarchy arose based on white blood. American Indians with white ancestry, usually those with the most slaves, stood on the top. Then you had the pure Indians were next, and people of African descent were at the bottom. So you see, these things were happening, interactions were happening all the way back through the 1600s, all the way up through the 1800s, okay? You cannot look at an African American and tell them who they are, okay? You can't do it. There is a complex history in the United States that the globe does not know about. Many inside the United States of America don't know about this complex history because they wipe it out of the history books. Now, as far as African American ancestry, it can go several ways, at least 3 different continents, because this is where African Americans sprang up from in the Americas. But you can't look at me and tell me you're indigenous. I'm not. I'm African American. I'm not of dual heritage. Now, a long time ago, my mother had at least one relative that was indigenous. The rest were African American with mostly African lineage as far as the distant ancestry. And there's some that goes back into the 18 and 1700s where the essays were taking place. How many African Americans have indigenous ancestry? Who knows? It all depends on where they were located, those ancestors were located, the time they got there, and what was going on. But no, all African Americans do not have indigenous ancestry. Some do, though. Hope that explains that.